welcome to another video. Today it is part 3 of the McCalls 7945 sew along. Today we're going to be putting together the front panels of the skirt, putting the dress together and finishing off our dress. So let's get started. My lower front bodice here, and again I have marked on the square. This is where the split is going to stop, and I've marked it onto the left hand side only because I'm only going to do one split for this skirt. I've also marked my notches in, and we need to stay stitch between the notches on this particular part before we do anything else. So the first step for the lower front and side is stay stitch side edges of lower front between the notches. So I've just done that. We've already made our ties, so we're going to be putting these onto the lower side fronts. The first thing I want to do though is I am going to finish the edge of one side with bias binding, and that's going to be the side that I'm going to leave open for the split. The other side I'm going to be doing as a French seam. So I'm going to get that done for both the lower front section and one side of the lower side section. So again, you want to make sure that you are transferring all of your markings. This is where the tie is going to go. We've got the notches which will help us match up the center front to the sides, and we have a little circle up here which is going to be where the bodice will need to be matched to, and again there's some notches along the side there. I'm not including these circles because these are where the pockets go, and I haven't cut the pockets because I don't want pockets in this dress. I also need to mark in the square, which is where the split will go to on the one side. Now it's important to add your tie before you put on your bias binding for the side that is going to have the thigh split on it. So you want to match up the flat edge of your tie with the flat edge of the skirt piece. There are marks which we have just transferred, the large and small circle. You want to make sure that you have the seam of your tie facing towards the bottom of the skirt, and we are going to just base this into place at 1/4 of an inch, and then I can sew on my bias binding. So I have bound the edges that are going to be the ones which I have the split in, and I have marked my point there. So I am now going to pin those together, right sides together, and sew from the top edge to the marking for the split and back stitch there. I'm then going to press everything under and press this bias binding under as well, and I can finish this off by either by machine stitching or by hand. I've not decided yet. I think probably machine stitching because I'm going to machine the hem as well, but I can cross that bridge when I come to it. So I'm going to pin this centre front panel to the side panel, right sides together, and sew at 5/8 of an inch to the marking that we've made for the thigh high split. Okay, so I have sewn together the left hand side, so I'm now sewing together the right hand side, and I have pinned on my tie, and again I have the seam of the tie towards the bottom of the skirt. It's pinned in place from the markings we did earlier, and I'm going to sew this with a French seam. This is a straight seam, so we can do this with a standard French seam. So I'm going to sew at 1/4 of an inch first, trim, press, and then sew at 3/8 of an inch. And I'm going to do that all the way down to the hem. Once you've sewn the seam at 1/4 of an inch, you then want to trim it down by half, so it goes down to 1/8 of an inch, and you'll end up with lots of little bits that look like this. I'm then going to go and press this so the right sides are together, and I can then finish the French seam with a 3/8 of an inch line of stitching. I've finished off my French seam by stitching at 3/8 of an inch away from the folded edge, and then I've pressed my French seam towards the side. This is the centre panel. Whilst I was there, I also pressed this seam open, and then I pressed all the way down to the hem so that the bias binding was on the inside for a nice crisp finish here, and we're going to machine stitch this into place a little bit later. But the next step is step number 12, and that is pin lower section to bodice front, right sides together, matching circles, adjust ease, baste, stitch to lowest large circle, trim seam allowance, turn seam allowance towards lower section, fold in fullness at centre, and tack in place. So that's quite a long mouthful. So I haven't got my large circle marked underneath this point here as I've ironed it away. It's one of the joys of friction pens. So I'm going to remark that in, and it is the pivot point at the centre, and then we can pin our bodice fronts to this. And what I would like to do is sew from one side seam to that large circle back stitch, and then start a whole different line of stitching along there. It's also asking us to ease in the lower section of this bodice front. I'm going to pin it roughly and see if easing is a viable option, or if I could just run some gathering stitches in there, because there is that possibility as well. So I'm going to get that all pinned into place and show you what to do next. Okay, that actually eased in quite nicely. There was a bit of excess in there, but it does go together. You just need to use lots of pins, and I'll show you how I've pinned on when I do the other side. So I've got the right sides together, and you can tell this is the wrong side because you can see the understitching, and then obviously this is the right side of the fabric, so right sides together. I didn't baste these two raw edges together. That's definitely something that you can do if you're a bit worried about your fabrics misbehaving and slipping all over the place. For me, this stuff is sticking together quite nicely, so I didn't baste that side together, but that is something that you can do, and it is step 4 of the pattern instructions, is to baste that those lower two edges together. So I'm going to pin in the other side matching up the center front, and I'll get that pinned and I will show you what that looks like. So I have this all pinned into place. One thing, because we've done the construction this way, you want to make really certain that you haven't got this back piece twisted, that it is a nice clean loop this way round, because if it's twisted, your dress will not go together correctly. I'm going to sew this seam at 5/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to finish off this raw edge with bias binding. So if you're careful and you hit your large circles, this is what the front outside should look like. And then this is what the inside's going to look like. As you can see, we've got all of this raw edge and excess to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this with bias binding, but I'm actually going to kind of snip off these points here so that I have a little bit less bulk to deal with, and also I won't be able to turn the bias binding at a sharp corner like that. I'm going to need to round this edge off. So I'm going to do that as I sew, and then trim off the excess once the bias binding is on, just to make sure that it's going to work the way that I want it to. So I'll show you that as I go. Okay, so I've sewn the bias binding on with the skirt side up, and as you can see here, I've kind of just rounded it around this point area. So I'm going to trim all of this excess bulk away here, and when I come to flip it and top stitch it down on the other side, I'm going to do that nice and carefully around this curved edge here as well. Now the reason that I have sewn it with the skirt side up is because I know that this is going to be, as it were, the wrong side of my binding. I'm going to be turning it back on itself like this, so I want the top stitching on this side to look nicest. If you need a particular side of the binding to look the neatest, you want to sew it onto the opposite side first. I think that makes sense. But yes, I sewed it to this with the skirt side up. So I'm going to trim all of this bulk away, and then I'm going to top stitch my binding down using my blind hem foot in the same manner that I did with these ones. Okay, so the pattern wants you to fold in fullness at center front and tack into place. And I have pressed my bias binding, and what I did was that I kind of smooshed it under. Didn't do it quite as neatly on that side as I did this side, but I'm going to hand stitch that piece together so that it really does lie flat. I'm then going to tack the bias binding in place to this seam and this seam over here and see how that works. If it's not holding it down as much as I would like, I will then probably go in and run a line of stitching through here, and I can do that with a blind hem stitch, the one that I use on hems mostly, obviously. So yeah, I'm going to have a play around and see which method I like best for holding this down. But for this one, you kind of want to smoosh, as they say, fold in the fullness and then tack it together. I have hand tacked the bias binding to the front seam. I have sewn those little bits together there. I have hand tacked it to that seam, and I've done the same for the back facing as well. I've just hand tacked it to the French seams for that. The next step is the pockets, but as I mentioned, I don't particularly like pockets in this type of dress, and especially for this lightweight fabric, so I haven't cut these, but I do have a tutorial that you can find here of how to French seam pockets in. So the next thing that I am going to do is sew up the side seams with French seams. To sew your side seams together with a French seam, you're going to want to put them wrong sides together and pin, and you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The important part is that you leave your facing piece up and out of the way, because we're going to use this to finish off the armhole and the seam a little bit later in the process. So once you have sewn your seam at 1/4 of an inch, which you can just about see there, we're going to then trim this down to 1/8 of an inch, and you're going to snip into the top there and not trim off all of this piece as well. So again, I will show you what that looks like when I get there. So hopefully you can see there that I have trimmed the seam allowance in half, and I've just notched into the seam allowance here. I'm actually going to trim a little bit more off from just up here, but we want to leave this all intact because we're going to fold this over later to finish off our arm edge nicely. So I'm then going to go and press this right sides together so that I can finish sewing this French seam. So once you've pressed everything, you can see that we still have the facing kind of free floating out here. So the next thing that we need to do is sew this side seam together at 3/8 of an inch. This is now our interior, so we have the right sides together, and that's going to finish off the French seam. Then we can deal with the facing. Okay, so I have sewn my French seam at 3/8 of an inch and still have this facing to deal with. So what you want to do is you want to bring the facing back over all of the work that you've just done, and you're going to stitch along the previous seam line that you've done here, the 3/8 of an inch. And bear in mind, this has got a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on it, which is why we have this little excess poking out. And so you're going to sew from the bottom of the facing up to this line of stitching here, back stitch, and trim off all of the excess. And when you turn that through, you should have a nicely finished armhole. So I'm going to get that done, and I'll show you what it looks like when we're finished. At the moment I've just sewn mine in place. I haven't trimmed any of the excess off. So that's the view that we were just using. We used that stitching line. So what you want to do is kind of pull the facing back on itself, and then you can see there that we've got a nicely finished armhole. Obviously it's a little bit bulky at the moment because we haven't trimmed it. We are just going to, again, I'm probably going to turn this up and tack that down just so that the raw edge of the bias binding is not on display. That's just a personal preference of mine, so that, yeah, but once I've trimmed all of that and given it a nice press, that's what it's going to look like. So we're going to repeat this process for the other side. Okay, so we don't need to do the shoulder seam because we've already done that, and we won't need to slip stitch. So we're going to need to move on to hemming our dress. I'm going to finish off the front slit first. I am going to sew this down by machine, and I'm going to use my blind hem foot again just to get myself a nice straight edge with this one. Then I need to even out the hem. The front panel is an inch shorter than the two side panels, and then the two side panels are an inch shorter than the back panel. I mean, to me it made sense that I needed to add, because I'd added an inch of length to the front panel, which I'm glad I did, by the way. It then made sense that I needed to add the same amount of length to the back panels, because you needed, you know, if you're adding an inch of length in here, then you need to do the same for this. But I have ended up with the back panels being an inch too long to the side panels, and then the very front panel being 2 inches shorter than these back panels. So I'm going to even out the hem so that I can do a narrow hem on that in a minute. Okay, so I've pressed my side seams to the back and I have evened out my hem. I did that by finding the shortest panel, which was the centre front, and the two side panels were then an inch longer than that, and then the back panels were 2 inches longer than that. So I used my quilting ruler, measured up with my friction pen, drew a line and just chopped everything off. So I'm now going to hem this, and I'm going to do that by sewing a line 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, and I'm going to use that as my pressing guide. So I'm going to press it up by 1/4 of an inch and then up and again by 1/4 of an inch and stitch that down. The reason I run a line of stitching is because it helps me be really accurate when I'm turning the hem up, so I don't end up turning up some bits more than others. I sewed my line of stitching at just 1/4 of an inch. I've used that as my first pressing guide, and then I've pressed the hem up again to enclose the raw edge. And I'm going to use my blind hem foot to hem this, but I'm going to use it in the same manner as I use it for the bias binding, and that's just because it helps me get a nice straight edge. So we're going to hem that, and then our dress is done. If you have any questions at all, let me know in the comments section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. I am in love with this dress. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and as I can show you here, I have styled it a few different ways. The way that I've got it on at the moment, with my really dainty silver jewellery and some red ballet flats, which I know you can't see, but that's what I'm wearing, is probably how I will wear this most often. But you could totally throw on flip-flops, a giant hat and some sunnies to wear it out and about on holiday, which is definitely something I will be doing. I also think that putting some high heels with this and some statement jewellery could make for a really fun evening outfit, especially again if you're on holiday, or if you're like me and you're lucky enough to live next to the beach in the summer months. This could be a really awesome awesome evening outfit. As I mentioned in the first video, my Patreon peeps voted for this pattern to be made into a sew along, and you can see along the bottom here everybody's name is scrolling past nice and quickly. Thank you, thank you, thank you to every single one of you for supporting me and taking the time to vote on the patterns that I should be putting up for sew alongs. It's been really fun having you guys give me your input, and I have been making some things that aren't necessarily in my comfort zone, which has been really eye-opening, because this dress is awesome. I don't think I'm ever going to make the mini version of this dress. I'm not a huge fan of my legs and I prefer to keep them covered up, hence me going to midi dresses and midi skirt lengths. If you watched any of my earlier videos like a couple of years ago, you will see that I was all about the minis and boots, and yeah, that kind of has fallen by the wayside. I much prefer covering those up and being very fitted on top. It's been really fun to get you guys to vote on different types of patterns for me to do sew alongs for, and as I say, you are definitely pushing me out of my comfort zone, which is awesome. I made this dress out of a viscose that I got from the textile centre. It's called Electric Feathers, and I only had 4 meters of this. The pattern does call for 5 meters, and as long as you're careful about how you cut things out, you can definitely get it out of I think I had just over 4 meters. I do only have teeny tiny little scraps left, which I could probably use for a yoke of a shirt, which I kind of really want to do now, and those kind of things. So pockets, that's all I've got left out of the 4.1-ish meters that I had of this fabric. But yeah, I absolutely love it. The textile centre had called it Electric Feathers, and I think that is very apt. It is stunning, and I really like viscose to wear at this time of the year. It moves really well, as you can see from the clips of me twirling in it. It's nice and lightweight, and it is very comfortable to wear in the heat. So big thumbs up for this fabric and a big thumbs up for this print. It was one of those prints that I had in my stash that I was just like, oh yeah, I'm not precious about this, it'll be fine. And then the more I was working with it, it was just like, oh my god, I hope I love this dress because I love this print, and what am I going to do if I don't like it? So I'm so pleased with how this has come out. If any of you guys do follow along with the sew along, please tag me in any pictures that you share on social media and use the hashtag Sian made me do it, because I always love seeing what you guys have created. I really hope you've enjoyed this video series. If you have, please give this video a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!